Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Ben Murphy. Ben is a part of our Extension Master Gardener class of 2022. He's an avid collector of cacti and succulents, as well as other interests. And without further ado, Ben, welcome.
Thank you, Colleen. Thank you, Mary, as well, for being here today and for expertly facilitating today's session. Yep, I'm so excited to share my passion with you all today about cacti and succulents. I have a lot of personal connections to these sorts of plants. Growing up in the desert Southwest, I would see prickly pears all around me in southern Colorado. My father had some really interesting succulents in his office growing up, but my mother also has a really impressive sunroom in her house, and a couple of her prized plants are actually in today's PowerPoint, so I was happy to get some pictures of her on that. But I love succulents. Succulents are everywhere. I just want to hop back to this title slide just to give a little bit more context to this picture. That's my partner, Dave, standing right next to this huge mound. Hey, hey, Dave. This huge mound of opuntia that are down in Richmond. If you're down by the Ship Canal area in Richmond, you'll see large containers just filled up to the brim with eastern prickly pear. A lot of folks don't realize that there are native cacti and succulents here in the Northern Virginia area. And if you recognize them, you'll actually start seeing them pretty much everywhere you look. But again, I really hope that you enjoy this presentation as much as I do. Let's go ahead and get going. I wanted to go ahead and give folks a sense of what we're going to be covering in today's conversation. We really want to start off with defining some terms so that we're all sort of starting out on the same page and understanding what succulents and cacti are, because the definition is not as straightforward as you may assume. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the major species groups in the succulent arena, some very familiar species that you'll recognize from your big box stores, or people's houses or offices or the like, very familiar plants. We're going to talk a little bit about plant selection and care, both for indoor and outdoor plants, talking a little bit about common pests, disease, and hopefully the treatments for those diseases as well, to keep your collection thriving and happy. And then I've also pulled together a lot of frequently asked questions here that we can hopefully answer for you on the line today. So succulents are definitely a craze. Have you gotten into the succulent craze? I definitely have. Houseplants in general have just been exploding in popularity over the past several years, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic. Houseplants are a $15 billion industry in the United States. They've increased their sales by more than 20% during the pandemic. And succulents are one of the most popular types of houseplants and are definitely hoping to drive that trend. The push towards houseplants and succulents has also really been informed by increasing urbanization. People are living in smaller and smaller houses, in condos, apartments. Maybe you don't have a whole lot of outdoor space or just a little bit of an outdoor terrace or something like that. And houseplants and succulents, nice little compact plants, many of them are anyway, that can allow you to really scratch that itch of growing something green in your house, even if you have a little apartment. Even though succulents are very trendy right now, they've been around for a long time. There are historical texts from 1695, back in the 17th century, that document aloe plants being cultivated in botanical gardens in colleges in England for medicinal purposes. So that's very interesting just to know that even while it's a trend right now, it's been going on for a long time. Succulents have also been a historic food source for humans around the world. Plants including portulaca and prickly pear are commonly consumed in many parts of the world. So as you can see, the craze continues, and hopefully by the end of this presentation, you're going to be a part of it. But really understanding what succulents are is a really important thing for us to sort of get on the same page before we dive in here together. In its simplest, most boiled down form, succulents are plants that have evolved to retain water, usually in response to their native habitats and environments, which is often in arid climates or places with poor soil. Across all families of plants, about 3 to 5% of the individual species are considered succulents. Most of these plants are known for their ability, again, to survive on minimal water, although many of them can absorb mist or dew from the air. If any of you have ever had a euphorbia, you'll definitely be familiar with the toxic sap that they produce. Many succulents do share that trait. It's important to note that succulents as a term does not really describe a specific family. There's no plant family just called succulents. It's a term that describes attributes of a range of species across families and is not technically a taxonomic category. There are succulent plant species that occur in approximately 60 different plant families. The diagram that you see on the right just shows some of the major plant families and some of their succulent members. Some families are almost exclusively succulents, for instance, Cactaceae, whereas other genera like Euphorbia have a mix of both succulent and non-succulent plants. There's an important distinction to make here too. In the title, I'm talking for this presentation, I'm talking about cacti and succulents. It's important to note that all cacti are succulents, but most succulents are not cacti. Cacti are a family that would be considered to be a part of the succulent broader grouping of plants. It's also important to sort of make a note here on some plants that are commonly considered to be succulents. Most orchids aren't succulents, most epiphytes and many species of euphorbia, including that lovely poinsettia that you buy at the big box store over Christmas, are not considered to be succulents, partially owing to their anatomy. Another way that we can define succulents as distinct from other plants are the structures that they have evolved to have as a part of their anatomy in order to store water and succeed in their native environments. So most succulent plants do store water in modified leaves and stems. Some of the pictures on the right here are some indications of the form factors that those modified leaves and stems can take. You can see on the top the cactus, the mellow cactus with the lovely golden spines. Those spines are actually modified leaves, and the barrel that the leaves are growing from is a modified stem. Similarly, the prickly pear cactus that's next to that, the paddle itself is a modified stem, and the spines that used to be on those paddles before these were harvested for culinary purposes, those would be, again, the modified leaves. The beautiful little cotyledon pendens that's in the lower right-hand side of the slide is an example of a cute succulent, very traditional looking succulent with modified leaves, those chubby little leaves that have evolved to store water over the years. Very beautiful plant. There's another form of modified anatomical features within the succulent grouping of plants called the caudex. They're a little bit more rare than some of these other types of modifications, but there's a couple of examples of them on the lower left-hand side there. A caudex is essentially a modified stem that looks like a bulb that sits on top of the ground. Caudex plants are very popular for some niche collectors. Probably the most well-known example of a succulent that has a caudex is a ponytail palm, and there's some pictures of those later on in this presentation. I just wanted to also note that generally the term succulents do not include plants that have modified roots to store water. This would include most things that would be termed by botanists as geophytes. Those include plants that grow bulbs underground, so your tulips, your rhizomes like iris, even though these are modified parts of the plant that as a part of their function are modified to store water. Generally, those sorts of geophyte underground bulb forming plants are not considered succulents. One final thing that sets apart succulents and cacti from many other plants is the way that they perform photosynthesis. Most succulents have adapted to require very little water to perform photosynthesis as an adaptation to their native environments. This adaptation is called the crassulacean acid metabolism. So hopefully most of us know that plants, when they're doing photosynthesis, use little openings called stomata to draw carbon dioxide up into the plant to catalyze photosynthesis. But succulents do this a little bit differently. They've adapted to only open their stomata at night when it's cooler and there's less risk of evaporation, which is a big risk for many cacti and succulents in dry parts of the world. Succulents that use this form of photosynthesis store that carbon dioxide that they take in at night in the form of a chemical called malic acid to use during the daytime to keep the plant up and running when their stomata are closed and they can't take in any of that CO2. So this is a very unique adaptation for cacti and succulents. Malic acid, interestingly enough, is also the primary acid that you find in many of your edible fruits. It's the acid that is responsible for the sour taste of unripe apples and is also a food additive and is sometimes used in makeup. The diagram on the left here is a more complicated depiction of the crassulacean acid metabolism than I will get into at this point today, but there's a lot of interesting information about the way that plants can photosynthesize in alternative fashions online. I think I put a resource link in the guide for y'all if you want to learn a little bit more about the CAM. It's also abbreviated as CAM. So where do succulents and cacti come from? They're almost globally endemic. Succulents are found on every continent on the planet except for Antarctica. There are some really interesting biomes across the planet that have a high concentration of cacti and succulent species, most prominently the Karoo biome in South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, that area. You can see some little pictures of some of those plants that come from those regions on the screen in front of you, including the Karoo rose, which is the nice little stone plant with the yellow flower. The ubiquitous jade plant comes from this part of the world, as well as the crown of thorns. Many euphorbia species come from the southern parts of Africa. Another hot spot for succulents is the California and desert southwest of the United States and into Mexico. So you can see the classic Joshua tree as well as the saguaro cactus come from that part of the world. Madagascar is another hot spot where there are a lot of species. The Madagascar fan palm comes from there, as the name would suggest. But even though there are these hotspots across the planet, there are succulents and cacti in many other parts of the world. South America has a lot of species. It's a mellow cactus that's there with the lovely pink flower and crown on the top. The plant that's showing over Asia is a Crassula, and the plant that is reflecting over Europe is a Sempervivum. So there's many, many, many familiar species all across the world. It's important to note that while succulents do thrive in arid climates, they can be easily buried by drifting sand and therefore are not as common in places that have a lot of drifting sand, like the Sahara Desert area, parts of Australia. And due to this factor, Australia hosts very few succulent plants as compared to other continents. There are a lot of really interesting plant families that have a lot of succulent members. And so I was going to go over a few of them with you here. Many familiar plants you probably recognize. Cactaceae is a large grouping of species. There's approximately 1,750 individual members of this family. Cactus can both have modified leaves and modified stems. They, as a family, are dicots, meaning that they have two cotyledons, also known as embryonic leaves, that emerge when it's a seedling. Monocots are the other grouping of families. They only have one embryonic leaf. Many grasses are monocots. The characteristics of this family also include big water storage organs on many plants, like that saguaro that you see that's adapted to grow in very arid parts of the world. It's interesting that this family is almost exclusively New World. Only one species of cactus is known to be native in the Old World. That is the Ripsalis bassifera, or the mistletoe cactus, which is believed to have been spread from South America through Africa and into Sri Lanka by migrating birds who picked up the seeds from the fruit. That species is now native in Central Africa as well as Sri Lanka. Some other interesting features of cacti is that often their stems are ribbed or fluted with a number of ribs, which corresponds to a number in the Fibonacci sequence of numbers, which is also known as the golden ratio. So if you think back to your math classes in high school, you may remember this naturally occurring pattern that you see in a lot of other places like nautilus shells, or the way the sunflower seeds grow in their pattern. That's called the Fibonacci sequence. That's the same pattern that many cacti grow in. This adaptation really allows cacti to expand and contract easily for quick water absorption after rainy periods, followed by retention over long drought periods. So it's really a great adaptation that the plants have put into place to survive some of these very extreme environments that they're from. So some familiar species of cactus include, of course, the saguaro, tall, picturesque, seen in most Roadrunner cartoons from the 50s and 60s, very familiar to people. The mammillaria species beneath that, usually smaller, sometimes furrier, frequently found in big box stores, on people's desks at their offices. The epiphyllum at the bottom there, I have one of these. It's one of my favorite species. These are tropical cacti that grow in the jungle. They bloom at night for only a couple of hours, and so many collectors unfortunately miss their blossoms on the epiphyllum. Really beautiful plants that require actually part shade and a little bit more moisture than other types of cacti. The mellow cactus on the top right is from Brazil and is believed by scientists to be the first cacti that was encountered by Old World conquerors when they came from Spain and Portugal. The Christmas cactus right below that, very familiar, very similar traits to some of the epiphyllums in terms of their light requirements and sort of their natural habitat. And then below that is Opuntia humifusa, the eastern prickly pear, which is native to Northern Virginia and other parts of the eastern coast. I have this in my backyard. It's one of my favorite plants. Euphorbia is another very popular family of succulent plants. There's about 1,000 members of the Euphorbia family that are succulents. Like cacti, they can have a leaf or modified stem. They are dicots. As mentioned previously, they do produce a poisonous milky latex. If you cut or propagate these plants, please wear protective gloves to make sure that your skin doesn't get burned. The flowers on Euphorbia generally are tiny. Those crown of thorns flowers that you see at the top, those are some of the biggest flowers you're going to see on a Euphorbia. Some Euphorbia flowers are also very stinky. Just watch out when you're selecting your plant that you're not going to be bringing a corpse flower into your home. The family of Euphorbia is collectively termed as the spurge family and also includes other non-succulent plant species, including poinsettia. But there's some really beautiful plants in the Euphorbia family. The crown of thorns, lots of folks have that. The Euphorbia trigona, that African milk tree. I have a much smaller specimen of that sitting right to my left here in my sunniest window in my office. My mother has a gigantic pencil cactus. There's a picture later on in this presentation of her specimen. But some really unique species of Euphorbia that are very dramatic and very impactful for indoor displays. Crassulaceae, another very popular family of succulents, about 1,300 individual species that have modified leaves and stems. These are also dicots. Crassulaceae usually have these little chubby leaves that are modified to store those waters. That's a hallmark of these types of plants. They're worldwide. There's Crassulaceae in every continent except for Antarctica. This is a family of plants that Crassulacean acid metabolism was first observed in and after. But some really well-known species here. Aeonium, lots of folks grow these indoors and outdoors. Echeveria is probably your most classical or maybe even stereotypical succulent. You see these in a lot of flower arrangements. They're extremely easy to propagate. Sedum, that sedum album is a native plant here in Northern Virginia, very widely cultivated for indoor and outdoor use, especially as ground covers. The same thing with Sempervivum below it, the henninchicks. I have a burrow's tail. That sedum is one of my favorite plants. Can grow very large, trailing plant, can spill over a shelf very easily and beautifully. And of course, the classic Crassula ovata, the jade plant, which can actually grow into a jade tree. In Hawaii, I've seen a jade plant tree that was probably 8 feet tall, absolutely covered with blossoms. You may not have even recognized it as a jade plant, but it was absolutely gorgeous and just covered with bees. Sempervivums have some really interesting features. They have a rosette of pointed leaves. They're usually thinner than Echeverias. They're found in clusters, and many of them have some of those cobweb-like features that you may see on some of those ground cover patches outdoors. Those aren't from bugs. Those are actually a feature of the plant itself. Azoaceae is a really interesting family of succulent plants, about 2,000 plants, maybe a little less well known than some of the ones we've already discussed. They primarily have modified leaves as their structure. They are dicots. They're primarily from South Africa, but there are also some species from South America and Oceania. They include some very interesting species, including these living stones that you see on the lower left and the lower right, the lithops. Those are pretty popular amongst collectors. Their blooms are very pretty. These plants stay very small, so they're very appropriate for small spaces. But there are also some more familiar species in this family, including that Carpobrotus on the top, which is one of many plants that can be termed as an ice plant. These are native to South Africa from that Karoo region, but are incredibly invasive. If you've been driving along the California coast, you will probably have seen large fields of these ice plants growing in the rocky outcropping on the sides of the coast in California, and they are an invasive plant species. Some really pretty species in this particular family of plants. Portulaceae, about 500 species in this family, modified leaves and stems. These are primarily dicots, native to the Americas, Africa, and Australia. This is really the family of purslane. Many of these species are edible. And another interesting feature of this family of plants is that they're one of the very few that folks know about that can use both the CAM, crassulacean acid metabolism form of photosynthesis, as well as the more traditional C4 carbon fixation photosynthesis that plants like corn, for instance, use. They have an ability to photosynthesize both ways. Again, many portulacas, many purslanes are from here. The common purslane that you see all the time on your top right, that moss rose purslane, very popular plant in ground cover applications, thrives in our native environment here in Northern Virginia. Also can be rather invasive, some of these species. I have a lot of familiarity of weeding these plants from in between my flagstones. So they can really be a spreader. Agavoideae is another very popular plant family of about 300 plants. Their modified structure is primarily the leaf. As opposed to many of the other families we've already talked about, these are monocots. So again, they only have one embryonic leaf that comes out. They look a little grassier. Their leaves generally occur as rosettes at the end of a woody stem. They're New World plants, North and Central America. In fact, I don't believe there are any in South America. This is a subfamily of the asparagus family that also includes some well-known species, including the yucca, agave, as well as the agave virginica, which does grow in Virginia. It's adapted primarily to nocturnal pollination, interestingly enough, by medium-sized moths and larger spink moths. However, ruby-throated hummingbirds are also really attracted to that agave. I've been trying to source this plant for my garden a few weeks now. I'm really interested in getting it into my own collection. Asphodelaceae has about 500 plant species in this subfamily, which is also a subfamily of the asparagus family. Some pretty popular species are included in this subfamily, including Gasteria. I just bought a Gasteria at Home Depot yesterday. I'm hoping that it's going to be okay. Aloe is probably the most popular plant species in this subfamily. Aloe vera is very commonly cultivated around the world, although Haworthia is also a very popularly cultivated type of succulent for collectors. These are native to Africa, Madagascar, and a few in Australia. And again, part of a broader subfamily that includes some plants that are definitely not succulents, including daylilies, poker plants, and of course, asparagus. There are, as I mentioned, over 60 plant families that include succulents. And so here's just a brief selection of some popular ones that are in smaller groups or families that we didn't go over today. That Pachypodium at the top left is an example of that Madagascar palm that my dad had on his desk when he was a doctor and still practicing. Used to visit that plant in his office. The Lifesaver cactus right next to it, that's a picture of one of my plants. I love that plant, although the blossom doesn't smell too great if you get your nose too close to it when it's blooming. The ponytail palm on the top right, that's an example of that plant that I mentioned that was probably the most well-known plant example with a caudex at the bottom, at the base of the trunk you see there. String of pearls and the snake plant are also really popular and well-known succulents. Finally, just want to underscore the point here that there are a number of native succulent plants to Virginia, a few less here in Northern Virginia, a few more if you get towards the southern parts of Virginia and North Carolina. There's a higher concentration of native succulent plants, but there are still some that you will see across our region, including the Agave virginica, which I mentioned previously. American sea rocket is found on the east coast of the US and up into Canada. In fact, it grows on the dunes of coastal beaches as well as on the shorelines of freshwater lakes. It likes sandy, well-draining soil, and I've definitely seen this plant out in Rehoboth Beach a few times. Euphorbia marginata, or the snow on the mountain, can be found throughout much of the eastern parts of the United States into Canada, as well as in China, where it has been introduced as a non-native naturalized plant. And of course, there are the two primary species of native Opuntia prickly pears that you'll find in Virginia. Opuntia cespitosa has that little red center of its blossom, which sets it apart from the Opuntia humifusa, the eastern prickly pear, which I had mentioned previously. So I'll go ahead and pause here and see if there are any questions in the chat that we should be taking care of right now.
Well, Ben, as predicted, someone asked which of these are edible. I know you mentioned portulaca, but are there any of these succulents which are edible other than prickly pear or aloe?
So yes, those would probably be the three best examples that I would provide. I will also just say that the prickly pear, there are different parts of the plant that are edible. So if some folks eat the pads are very popular to eat in Mexican cuisine, for instance, but they also produce fruit that if the conditions are right and they're not too sour, you can make a hell of a margarita with the prickly pear fruit. So there's definitely some good ways to use that. Personally, I don't care for it personally, but I know many people who do use it in salads and think it's popular in some Middle Eastern and Mediterranean cuisines as well. I am not an expert in the culinary uses of cacti and succulents, so I'll leave it at that. So let's pivot here to talk a little bit more about selecting a good plant, both for indoor and outdoor purposes. So many of the same bits of advice that you would get for any kind of plant apply for cacti and succulents as well. You're going to be wanting to avoid plants that look visibly sick or unhealthy. If you see a plant that's really dried out, it looks like a skeleton of its former self, maybe don't buy that one. With cacti and succulents, you especially want to steer clear of any plants that you see that have browning spots or mushy spots. That could be an indication of root rot, which you definitely do not want. If you see evidence of any sort of pests, that is another thing that you want to steer clear of. Another grouping of plants to steer clear of are spray painted plants that you see on the bottom right there. This is a really unfortunate trend that we see in big box stores where the growers are actually spray painting living plants and trying to trick people into thinking that this is the actual color of these plants. These plants, you can buy them. They may regenerate. They will continue to grow, but they will be weakened. So just be aware that, this is not going to be the healthiest plant that you will buy if it has spray paint all over it. Although some people do specialize in rescuing plants like this. The grafted cacti that you see on the upper left is an example of a Gymnocalycium cactus, also known as a moon cactus, that has been grafted to rootstock. I think it's a dragon fruit cactus in this particular instance. Those moon cacti on the top, so in fact, these are two different plants, is the point I'm trying to make. The cactus on the top, as you can see, they've been selectively bred to have a specific, rather shocking color that's not necessarily seen in nature. And due to this modification, that moon cactus is unable to perform photosynthesis. It doesn't have chlorophyll. And so they have to graft these baby cactus to the rootstock in order to allow the top part to survive. So just be aware that grafted cacti like this usually only live for about 2 to 3 years. Both of these are living plants and they're growing at different rates. So as the rootstock grows, that joint, the graft in between them, can potentially break. And if it does break, the top part of the cactus will die. Although you may still have a lovely dragon cactus on the bottom, so it's not necessarily the end of the world. You definitely should stay away possibly from fake flowers. This is a very unfortunate trend that you see in these plants as well. Folks will actually hot glue a plastic, or in some cases a straw flower, out to the top of the cactus. It's not the end of the world. These fake flowers can be pried away from the plant gently, and some other folks just sort of leave it. And as the cactus grows, the flower may fall off. But just be aware that in pulling off that flower, you're at risk of both injuring yourself due to the spiny nature of a lot of those cactus, but there's also the potential to injure the plant as well. There are some really highly valuable and interesting characteristics of some cacti that collectors find to be especially prized. Variegation, so similar to many other houseplants, if you have plants that look a different color than they would be otherwise occurring, that is a valuable feature, as well as crested cactus, or cactus that are growing in they call it a monstrose fashion. They look like monstrous, lumpy sort of forms rather than their natural form. These are mutations and are also very highly prized by collectors. And so there's an example here on the bottom right of a cactus that is both variegated and crested. I'm sure it was very expensive and I can't afford that cactus. Some tips here just generally on care, safety, and sanitation practices. When you're working with cacti and succulents, just be sure that you're gardening safely. When you're outdoors, wear those sunglasses, wear your sunscreen and your protective clothing, including a hat. Avoid gardening at the hottest time of the day. Whether you're indoors or out, wear those gloves, especially when you're handling sharp tools or even sharper cacti. When you are handling especially spiny or sharp plants, you can consider wrapping the plant gently in a towel to help protect yourself. You can also protect your hands with some leather gloves. I've seen people repot cacti using barbecue tongs as well. You have to be extra careful about not damaging the plant, but just be sure that you're taking good care, especially with Opuntia. Opuntia as a family can be very problematic to handle, not only due to the spines, but they have these little things called glochids that are present on the pads. So this little devilish plant that's pictured here, the Opuntia microdaisies, the bunny ear cactus, which is super cute, usually stays very small. You see these at big box stores all the time. I have one. These are little devil plants. These little glochids on these plants, I swear they could hop out of the plant and just hop into your hand, and they're very difficult and painful to remove. Even a slight brush across an Opuntia pad can potentially gift you with some of these glochids deep into your palm. So just take extra care and not to handle these plants without that protection. If you do get glochids in your hands, don't touch your eyes, don't touch your nose. It would be even worse for you in that situation. Removing glochids with tweezers will usually work. However, they are very small and difficult to see, especially for people who may need glasses or something like that. So an alternative way to get those out of your hands if you are in a crisis is to gently wrap your hand with gauze and use good old-fashioned white glue all over that gauze. Let it dry for about half an hour, and then you can peel it off, and that should take out, 95% of those remaining glochids. Finally, you also want to just remember that you're practicing good sanitation practices, both indoors and outside, to help ensure that your plant collection is free from pests and diseases. These practices include pruning dead material from your plants, keeping the foliage clean of dust and debris, quarantining any new plants that you have in your collection away from the rest of your collection for at least a week to monitor for any signs of pest and disease, making sure your tools that you use for pruning or taking cuttings are very well sterilized, and of course addressing any pests, damage, or disease on your plants as soon as you see the signs. So one of the really cool things about cacti and succulents is that many species are very easy to propagate. Generally speaking, much easier to be able to propagate by a leaf or a cutting than they are by seed. However, succulent seeds can be sourced online, and you can do that if you'd like to do that. There are some folks who really enjoy growing cacti from seed. It takes a while for those seeds to germinate, and they stay microscopic for a large amount of time, but people really enjoy watching these teeny tiny little grains practically grow up into a cactus. Some groupings of species are more easily propagated from leaves. These can include Echeveria, Pachyphytum, Conchoe, Crassula, Sedum, and then there's others that are just going to be more successful from cuttings. These include Haworthia, Opuntia, some Euphorbia. If you have a columnar cactus, aloe, these sorts of plants are just easier to do from a cutting. If you have a question on propagating your individual species, it's recommended that you sort of look online for guidance on which propagation method would be most appropriate for your plant. It's important to know that if you are going to be propagating your plant, and I'm going to go into on the next couple of slides here, the specific process to do that either through a leaf or cutting, you need to make sure that you're sterilizing the potting mix that you're going to be putting your propagated cutting or leaf into before put that cutting into the soil. And that is because when you're propagating, that part of that plant that you're looking to propagate is very susceptible to things like fungus and mold and pests, and can really mess up your propagation if those pathogens are present in the soil. So if you're going to be propagating, and in fact, if you're going to be repotting your plants, this is also a recommended step. You sterilize your potting mix in the oven or microwave to destroy any of those organisms that are present. If you're going to do this in the oven, all you got to do is preheat the oven at 200 degrees, fill a disposable roasting pan with up to 3 inches of soil, moisten the soil with water a little bit. You don't want it to be sopping wet. You just want to have a little bit of moisture in there. You cover that pan tightly with aluminum foil. You're really looking to steam that soil in the oven. Put the oven-safe food thermometer through the foil into the soil, and you want to bake that soil until the temperature reaches 180 degrees, and you need it to maintain at that temperature for 30 minutes. You can adjust the oven temperature as needed to keep it at 180 degrees, and then after you have had that 180 degrees for 30 minutes, you could take it out and let it cool off completely before you put your plant into it. You don't want to stick your propagated leaf cutting into a pot of boiling soil. If you're going to do this in the microwave, all you need to do is fill a disposable microwave-safe plastic container with your soil moistened, microwave the soil on full power for 1.5 minutes. Unless your microwave is older or less powerful, it has less than 1,000 watts, consider microwaving it for a little bit longer, maybe 2.5 minutes. Again, you want to stick a thermometer into the soil to make sure that it has gotten to at least 180 degrees. If it doesn't read between 180 and 200 degrees, you want to go ahead and put the soil back into your microwave and continue to heat it at 1-minute intervals until the required temperature range is reached. Once you get that temperature, you take it out of the bag, you can cool it off and use that soil. I will note too that microwaving your soil or baking it does gift your house with a very earthy odor. So just be sure that you're not doing this right before your guests come over, and don't do it right before you bake a souffle. It would just not be a good idea. So in terms of propagating by leaf, it's actually pretty simple. I believe that this is an Echeveria leaf that someone is propagating here on the right. This is sort of a diagram that shows the different life stages of the leaf that's being propagated. But basically you want to choose a really plump, nice looking leaf, preferably one that's already fallen from the plant. But if you use a sterilized sharp knife to cut the leaf from the plant close to the stem, that is also absolutely acceptable. Basically what you do is put the leaf right on top of soil in indirect light. So you don't want it under your bright glow lights, but maybe a little bit further away from it. And the leaf will start pushing out tiny little air roots that are going to look to make contact with the soil. And that's a plantlet. That plantlet will also start pushing out tiny little baby leaves, and will essentially use the mother leaf that you're using to propagate as a food source. So that original leaf will start shrinking, and completely dry up. And once that has happened, you will have a new plant. It's really important to know that watering is not necessary during this phase. In fact, it can be very problematic. If you water a leaf propagation, it may just suck up and you won't even know what happened to it the next day. But basically what you want to do is when you see those roots forming, you can lightly cover those roots with soil. You want to leave that propagation in place for probably a couple of months until it's well established before you think about repotting it into a more decorative pot or anything like that. But basically you can treat the plantlet as a new plant once that original leaf has dried out, which again may be a few weeks up to a couple of months. The process for doing this by a cutting is similar. However, of course, with a cutting, you're going to be primarily having to make that cut yourself. So just make sure that you are sterilizing your very sharp knife before you take any cuttings. The cutting should be at least an inch worth of stem to ensure that there is space for new roots to grow from that stem. You can kind of see, I think it's a myrtillocactus on the lower right, has been chopped at the top. That's just sort of an example of how you can just chop these cacti and allow that chopped off exposed surface to air dry and callus over for several days. That's a really important step. You can't just take a cutting and stick it right into the soil. You need to let that exposed surface callus over to protect the plant from losing too much moisture before you take any further steps. But once that cutting has calloused, you can place it on top of the soil to allow it to grow roots, the same way as you would with the leaf cuttings. And again, watering is not necessary or recommended until the plant has begun to grow new roots or new leaves. But once you have seen some substantial roots and you see some good growth, you can plant that cutting and water it as you would the rest of your plant collection. So I just wanted to give a quick note here. I'm talking primarily about indoor plant applications, but outdoor succulents are absolutely grown in our region in Northern Virginia and can be quite successful. Here are a selection of some year-round outdoor succulents that you don't have to take in over the winter. Some of these are natives, most of these are not. Portulaca is obviously a really popular ground cover, not just here in Northern Virginia, but all over the United States. Very successful plant that can be grown here outdoors. Obviously, the native Opuntia humifusa is a great outdoor plant selection here. A really beautiful yellow, creamy buttery yellow blossoms that happen in the spring. I've seen a lot of really great applications of Opuntia being planted, for instance, in hell strips out on the curb, where a lot of other things will not grow. Hylotelephium is another great plant. I sort of call these sedums as well, going into the same grouping as number 4, that stone crop, good for ground covers. Hens and chicks, the same thing, Sempervivum tinctorum, very popular outdoor plant. My grandmother had a big plot of hens and chicks that we used to go and visit when we were kids. It was very fun. Believe it or not, yucca does grow here in Virginia. We've seen that in a lot of outdoor gardens here in Arlington, very dramatic blossoms. Delosperma cooperi is another popular plant that is good for ground cover purposes, and that hardy agave as well as similar applications to the yucca. Generally speaking, caring for these outdoor succulents is simpler than growing desert species indoors for a lot of reasons. Succulents and cacti that will thrive in Northern Virginia over the winter will need to be cold hardy down to -5 degrees Fahrenheit. If you are in zone 6B, you can look up your USDA hardiness zone online. They have an address lookup. But just want to encourage people to think about using succulents in outdoor applications. They're really beautiful, hardy plants and can bring you a lot of joy in your outdoor gardening arrangements. So if you are going to be working with outdoor succulents and cacti, some considerations you just want to keep in mind here is, first and foremost, light. Most succulents do require up to 8 hours of direct sunlight a day. There are some plants that could potentially grow in shadier applications, but in outdoors that's tougher. So you want to make sure that you have a nice sunny location for these plants. Succulents do prefer well-draining soil. So if you have a bed that's constantly soggy and wet, that's probably not the best place for some of your succulents. You want to also make sure that the drainage is year-round. So if you live next to, for instance, a periodic stream or something, if it's wetter in the spring than during some drier parts of the month, just keep that in mind. You can water your outdoor succulents judiciously when the soil appears dry. Most succulents that are adapted to outdoor life here in Northern Virginia won't need a huge amount of water, but you can look for wrinkles and desiccation on the plant to indicate if you really know that succulent needs a little bit of extra water. Overwatered plants, you will generally be able to tell this, that they are yellowed, they're dropping leaves, and generally look like they're rotting from within. Airflow is also really important for outdoor succulents, especially to help to deter pests, mold, and mildew. So if you have an area of your yard that is particularly muggy or humid, doesn't seem to be a lot of airflow, that might not be the best place for those hens and chicks. And then finally, fertilizer is generally not needed for succulents outdoor, but can be applied in the active growing season if you want to encourage additional growth. Most of these plants are used to dealing with very low nutrient environments. And so just know that some species may react to fertilization with a spurt of growth that may not be sustainable over time. So it's happened in the past that some folks will fertilize succulents, they'll grow, they stop fertilizing it, and those parts may wither off and die and just sort of struggle. In terms of indoor care, I will say it is an order of magnitude more challenging than the outdoor care. However, it is absolutely worthwhile. I have about 100 different individual plants here in my collection indoors. So a tip of the hat to my partner for being very kind in his allowing me to have this habit and addiction. And it's taking over my entire office and now other parts of our house. But just in terms of an indoor care overview, some of the primary considerations here, and we're going to go into each one of these, are space planning. Think about light and temperature, watering, fertilizing, the airflow, soil mix. We're also going to talk a little bit about potting and repotting, arrangements, which are very popular for succulents, as well as planning for seasons. So around space planning, just a quick note here that succulents can be very small when you get them, but they can grow very, very large. These are 2 examples of plants from my mother's solarium in Colorado. On the left here is her wonderful crown of thorns, which probably is 8 feet in diameter with these super long spines at this point. She told me that she had chopped a couple of feet off this plant in the last couple of weeks, so this is not even the full totality of the size of this plant. Her pencil cactus, the euphorbia on the right, is absolutely gorgeous. It gets even redder in the summer months due to light stress, much bigger than what you would see in the big box stores. But just, make sure that you're thinking about this when you're thinking about selecting a plant for indoor. Space planning is important. These pictures on the right here, Euphorbia trigona, this is the same plant. This is what it looks like when it's a baby or a cutting on the bottom, and it can get to be as big as that plant or even bigger on the top. So just make sure that you're considering your available space when you're selecting a plant species to grow. Again, we've already talked about propagations and cuttings. So if a plant gets too big, many species can be cut back, and then maybe you can have a new plant or give it away to a friend. Some species do generally stay smaller. So some groupings that can stay a little bit smaller include Crassula, Echeveria, and Haworthia. However, there are some that can get very large given the right conditions. Right. So if you have all the light and everything else figured out in your house, some of these plants can grow very large. Many euphobias can get very big. Columnar cactus, like saguaro, can get very, very large inside. Mexican fence post cactus, golden barrel cactus, and then Opuntia species can also start to sprawl as well. So just keep that in mind as you're selecting your plant, especially when it comes to light and temperature. This is probably the most important thing to think about in terms of your setup when you're thinking about an indoor succulent collection. So given the native habitats of many of these plants, they're very much accustomed to getting a lot of sunlight. Many of these plants will need direct sunlight. Many of them will need bright indirect light. Many of you who are into houseplants will probably know the difference between these two, but this is a definition in terms that can really throw off a lot of people. But basically what we're talking about when we're saying a plant needs direct light, this is akin to broad daylight. This is a plant that needs unobstructed light for up to 8 hours a day. Your south and west facing windows are usually your best shot to get direct light in the house if you're not using grow lights. When we say bright indirect light, this is light that does not directly hit the plant from the light source, but is still bright. So if you have an east facing window, maybe you can get some good bright indirect light there. Or if you have your south or west facing window and are placing your plant a little bit further away from the window, there's a possibility to get some good bright indirect light that way. If you don't know your exposures, which of your windows are facing east, west, or whatnot, you can use a compass or a compass app on your phone to figure that out. It's also important to note that when you are moving your plants indoors or outdoors or around inside your house, you want to think about hardening them off, similar to how you would harden off your seedlings if you're growing them inside and you're moving them outdoors. So rapid changes in light or temperature levels can cause your plant to stress out, and you don't want that. So if you are going to be moving your plant to a new part of your house, move it to the new location for 1 hour the first day, then put it back in its original location. And then each subsequent day, you can continue increasing the time in the new location a little bit more until the plant is basically used to the new environment. That's a successful practice that you should keep when you're thinking about moving your plants around. It's also really important to note that most cacti, honestly, and some succulents will require supplemental lighting to replicate their natural environment. So just sticking some cacti in that south window, it may not do the trick. In terms of temperature, most commonly grown succulents are not cold hardy outside, so they're going to be wanting to stay indoors during the winter. You can potentially move them outdoors in the summer as well. Most of their ideal temperature range is 40 to 50 degrees on the low end and 90 to 100 on the high end. So most people's indoor setups should be just fine in terms of temperature. Some families that need direct light, again, the most light possible include cacti, Euphorbia, Echeveria, aloes, kalanchoe, agave, and crassula. Bright indirect species could include your Christmas cactus, epiphyllum, rispolus, ponytail palm, and then of course your low light, you can even get some species like sansevieria, which can thrive in low light environments. Grow lights, if you're going to be getting serious about growing cacti indoors, you definitely need to get familiar with how grow lights work. This can be very complicated due to differing manufacturing standards and different advice online. But one piece of advice that is pretty much universal is that if you're going to be selecting grow lights, you should avoid incandescent light bulbs and really go for LED or fluorescent lights. They give a better quality of light for the energy that you're going to be expending. Incandescent bulbs put a lot of heat in addition to the light that they generate and are less energy efficient. According to the Missouri Extension Office, if you have a cactus that needs the maximum amount of sunlight, they're going to need at least 1,000 foot candles or 20 watts per square foot of growing area in order to survive for up to 14 hours a day. If you want to measure the light output of your grow lights, there are smartphone apps that can do that, as well as commercially available light meters. Just want to note that when you measure that light level, you want to measure it on the plant surface, not directly underneath the light, because the amount of light that is generated from the plant directly under the bulb is going to be different than what is hitting the plant due to diffraction. Right. So it's recommended that you keep your grow lights relatively close to the plant, no further than 2 feet away. For fluorescent lights that throw off a little bit weaker light spectrum, it's recommended to keep them a little bit closer than that. You do want to go for grow lights that do provide the full spectrum of lights. However, if you want to potentially encourage blooming, you may want to try lamps with a warmer color temperature. You can check the product packaging to determine the light levels and color temperature that you need. And then also setting a timer, getting automatic light timers is a recommended best practice with your collections indoors. You don't want to have to go in and, every day turn on and off the lights at a specific hour. It's just a lot easier to get that timer. And also try and ensure that the light angle, that the lights that you're having are directly above the plant. So light that goes in a straight line down has a higher fidelity to get to the plant than it does if it's at an angle. As I mentioned, manufacturers have a lot of different types of measurements that they use on their boxes. So in addition to foot candles, you may see terms such as PAR, which stands for photosynthetically active radiation. PPFD stands for photosynthetic photon flux density, and UMOL, which stands for micromoles. It's very confusing, but the good news is there are online conversion calculators that you can use to convert different data types like these into foot candles. So it can be very annoying and complicated to select a grow light. However, if you go with a full spectrum LED or fluorescent light and have it at the appropriate distance away from the plant, that's probably enough to get you going. Watering is another really important consideration and something that can really mess people up. It's important to remember that most of these plants do not need large amounts of water in order to thrive, and that the timing of that water is really as important as the volume that you're providing it. All right. It's recommended that you don't water on a schedule. So don't just say that you're going to water all of your houseplants every Friday morning. Really, you should be taking a look at your plants to understand if they're thirsty rather than relying on a schedule. You want to make sure that for most cacti and succulents that plant has completely dried out from the prior watering before you give it more water, because cacti and succulents that sit in water, sit in moist environments, are at much higher risk of developing root rot. So definitely be judicious with your water. It's generally better to underwater rather than to overwater. And again, overwatered succulents will have very visibly unhealthy. They're going to turn mushy, their leaves might look yellow, and you may even get moldy soil. It's important to know that with your succulent, they may go into a dormant state in the winter months, and in the winter months, they need almost no water. So it's really up to you to do a little bit of research about your specific cactus to understand its dormant periods, because some cacti from other parts of the world may have their dormant period in our summer. One final note here is that you really should be watering your succulents from the bottom of the pot rather than with a watering can at the top, surface watering. The picture on the left here is an example of someone who is doing bottom watering for their plants. This is just generally recommended to allow the bottom of the pot to get some moisture as well and to encourage better root development for the plant. This takes a lot more time than just surface watering. So just keep that in mind before you get a collection of 100 cacti and succulents, because it can definitely take you a little bit of time. As I mentioned previously, airflow is really important. Encouraging air circulation in your collection is going to be critical to making sure that there's enough carbon dioxide in the room to encourage and support growth. Succulent air roots also need air circulation in order to thrive. And proper air circulation is also going to block and tackle for many moisture issues that can come up in your plants that can gift you with things like fungus gnats. Also, just keep in mind that artificial lights can potentially increase the ambient temperature in your room. It's not going to be a problem for a lot of cacti, but maybe with some cooler temperature succulents, it might be an issue for them. So encouraging the airflow may help to regulate that temperature, as well as the humidity. Because again, keep in mind that these plants are generally from dry and arid parts of the world. Your indoor air humidity is important to consider. Most cacti and succulents are okay with the 40 to 60% humidity range, which most people have in their houses. However, some jungle species may want more humidity, and some desert species may want less. So it's important to do a little bit of homework and also use common sense. If you know that your saguaro is from the Sonoran Desert, don't put it in your steam shower. Soil and fertilization are the other things that are important to keep an eye on. You want to make sure that the soil you're using is relatively low nutrient with very high drainage, so you don't get that root rot issue. Succulents will prefer a little bit more organic medium in the pot than cacti. Cacti will really love it if you enhance that commercially available succulent and cacti mix with things like gravel, grit, sand, or perlite. Again, fertilization is not necessary for most species, but can be used in some applications. Many folks who cultivate cacti and succulents indoors prefer to repot the plant if it looks like they need fertilizer. Cacti and succulents do prefer acidic soil, which is usually the pH level that you would get in the mixes from the big box stores, which is fine. But again, you do want to think about sterilize that soil before you use it. My personal mix for succulents is about 70% succulent and cacti mix, 30% perlite for my succulents, with it being almost 50% for the cacti. Potting and repotting is really important for your indoor plant collections. You want to make sure that your pots have drainage holes at the bottom. Again, you don't want those roots sitting in water. Unglazed clay pots or terracotta pots are the best practice here due to the fact that they are porous and they're not going to let those roots sit in water for too long. A plant that looks unhealthy may be root bound. So if you see a plant that you would think, oh, maybe I should fertilize this, it's also recommended to check out the roots, maybe depot that plant just to check out to see if the roots are forming a root ball. And if so, maybe pot them up into a larger pot. Again, protect yourself if you're talking about cacti. Use that towel, use the leather gloves to make sure you're protected. The pot that you select should only be marginally larger than the one that is replacing. Many succulents really like to be root bound, and the root ball should take up no more than 2/3 of the interior space of the new pot to allow room for growth. So in other words, if you have a plant that's in a 4-inch pot, you want to upgrade to like a 5-inch pot. You don't want to upgrade it to a 10-inch pot. The cactus will get lost in that pot and its roots won't really be successful and it may wither away. You do want to think about using a bamboo skewer or other sort of implement to tease away as much soil as you can from the roots when you're doing the repotting. And then once you repot, this is a really important thing to remember. A repotted succulent or cacti should not be watered for at least 2 weeks. If you repot, there is the potential to damage the roots of those plants, and damaged roots are much more susceptible to things like root rot, which is why it's recommended to not water those plants for at least 2 weeks to allow the plant to grow and get accustomed to its new home. Arrangements are so popular for cacti and succulents. You can see them at the big box stores pre-planted, but a lot of people love to do them for themselves. This is a really pretty arrangement outdoors. I believe that's an agave and a sedum, some really pretty plants here. You just want to remember that when you are putting together an arrangement that you want to select groups or pairings of plants that have similar needs. So you don't want to select a cactus that needs 100-degree temperature and only gets watered once a week with an epiphytic cactus from the jungle that needs shade and a lot of water. Obviously, they're going to not thrive in the same pot together, so just be careful in terms of that. Some people recommend that you don't pair fleshy succulents like a sedum or an echeveria with a cactus. Again, for part of those same reasons, the requirements may be a little bit different. However, I have seen some arrangements that have made those pairings successfully. But especially if you have like a permanent planting, you may want to reconsider doing that with a cactus, especially if it's a cactus that can grow very large. When you're having succulents outdoor, you can think about having a grouping and arrangement like this as a temporary sort of summer thing. You can move your indoor plants outdoors and put it into an arrangement. Just make sure you're bringing those plants back in before any frost or weather arrives that will damage that plant. And when you're thinking about planning for your arrangement, you want to definitely make sure that you're leaving space in the arrangement for growth. And you can use the same design principles that you do for other types of pots when you're thinking about succulents. So you could think about incorporating spillers, fillers, and thrillers into your pot to really have a dramatic presentation. Spillers are like echeveria that will grow over the side of the plant, like this one, I believe it's a sedum, although I'm not quite sure, with the orange flowers in the picture. The fillers, like the piece in the back, which provides a nice sort of background tableau for the arrangement, as well as the thrillers, like this agave that's really being very dramatic and flashy on the top of the arrangement. These can be very pretty, and they don't have to be permanent as well, so you can definitely get very creative. As I mentioned, moving your plants in and outdoors during the seasons is something that a lot of people do. Just remember that a lot of those plants that you have inside your house are not cold hardy, meaning that they're not going to survive outdoors in the Virginia winter. However, during those warmer months, it's entirely appropriate to put some of your succulents and cacti outdoor. Just remember to practice that hardening off practice to acclimate your plant to being outdoors without putting them into shock. You definitely want to monitor the weather conditions outdoors. If you move your cacti and succulents outside, especially for the first few weeks, if you see extreme weather in the forecast, you may want to bring something back in. So for instance, if it's early in the season and if you see a freak freeze that's going to be coming in, bring that plant in. can, but also with plants that are really acclimated to dry conditions like cacti. If you see there's going to be a 5-day rainstorm coming out or a tropical storm, maybe bring those in because that cactus and succulent may not want that much water. Remember that some plants do go into dormancy during the winter months. So if you have outdoor succulents, some of them may go into dormancy. Some Opuntia species in particular will look like they died and rotted. They will look deflated and maybe purple and really unhealthy in the winter, but they will absolutely regenerate in the spring. So just make sure that you're not ripping out some plants thinking that they're dead, but they may just be dormant. You can always Google image search for some examples of your particular succulent to see how it looks like when they're in their dormant period. Let's go ahead and pause here and see if folks have more questions before we go into the last section.
Would you mind reviewing Virginia native versus non-native succulents and what category is mistletoe in?
Mistletoe, that's a really good question on the mistletoe. I'm gonna have to refer that one to the help. I think that's in my brain. I want to say that's an epiphyte. I'm not 100% sure. It's also a parasitic plant, which makes me think it's maybe not a succulent, but I'm not 100% sure. I'm definitely going to Google this after this. Here's the Virginia native succulent plants. So here's, again, some succulent plants that are native to Virginia, that Agave virginica, American sea rocket, Euphorbia marginata, and the 2 Opuntias down below. There are more than this. This is just sort of a selection. I've been trying as I go along to call out the native succulents on the slides. So other questions?
Yeah, best places to buy succulents and cacti. You mentioned Home Depot, but are there other places?
Well, I will say that, there are a lot of succulents at the big box stores. Most of them are provided by national wholesale outfits like Altman Plants. And so despite some reputational issues, I've had some good luck with plants from big box stores. You just have to make sure that you are, applying that lens of, is this a healthy plant? Is this going to be successful in my environment? And sometimes take a risk. I won't lie. I have brought some plants home from big box stores and they did not do well. They've had secret hidden pests and whatnot. So it's just, again, important to quarantine those plants when you're bringing them into your collection. However, I've also had a lot of success in buying from reputable sellers online. There's a rich cactus and succulent trade on Etsy, which is an online app. You can also look at eBay. You just want to make sure that, there's a reputability behind those sellers and that they don't have a reputation, for instance, grabbing plants from native environments and selling them online. Definitely want to avoid that if at all possible. So do a little bit of research about the reputation about those resellers. But then finally, I'll also say that cactus and succulents are also available at smaller, more retail-oriented outlets here in our region. There are a couple that we at Master Gardeners go through, like Earth Sangha, that have a lot of native plants. Do have some selections of those. I was just out in Delaware. There's a big, fabulous garden center called the East Coast Garden Center. They have a lot of succulents there as well. They're all over the place. And so what I've done is basically try a vendor, and if the plant is successful, maybe I'll go back to them again. If they send me a plant which doesn't look like what it was presented on the internet or comes in sick and unhealthy, maybe I won't go with them. A lot of this is trial and error. I've killed many succulents and cacti in all transparency. So
do you have any recommendations for starter plants for people just getting into this?
Yes, absolutely. So Echeveria is a really easy plant to cultivate. We received a bouquet of flowers about 2 years ago that had a couple of Echeveria rosettes in them. I was able to propagate them, and now I have this really rich and thriving Echeveria plant right next to me on my right that's still from that one. So that's a really easy one to grow. Your jade plant is also very popular. They don't need quite as much light as a lot of other plants. They're very low maintenance and are sort of set and forget plants. So they could be really fun to grow. And on the cactus front, a lot of those Opuntias are very easy to grow. That little devilish Opuntia microdaisies, bunny ear cactus, if you have the right light condition, it really likes to be inside. Just be very careful about not brushing your hand up against it because you will regret it immediately.
Which ones attract hummingbirds?
Well, I know that the Agave virginica attracts hummingbirds to its flowers outdoors. I have never seen a hummingbird on our prickly pear. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that they wouldn't visit it. That's a good question for me to ask and maybe refer back to the master naturalist as well.
Are there any cacti or succulents that you could grow in a terrarium?
Terrariums are another form of arrangement vessel that some people use. I will just say that terrariums, because they're usually glass and are usually pretty moist, are not appropriate for a lot of really dry cactus. So maybe you could think about either using some succulents that are more open to living in moist environments, like maybe some of your stone crop or some of those jungle-oriented species, and just be very careful about monitoring the moisture level in that terrarium, that you're not sort of overdoing it with those plants. Keep an eye out for signs of mold and mildew. We'll talk a little bit more in the next section about pests and diseases, but just making sure that you're figuring for the moisture inside that terrarium is going to be really important to do.
Okay. Now you're talking about repotting, prompted someone to ask, can you cut roots of these plants to help keep them small when you're transplanting?
That's a good question. I know that keeping the succulents in a smaller pot longer than it should be in that pot will keep it artificially small, will inhibit the root growth. I would need to do a little bit more research to understand if trimming the roots like that would have an effect on keeping the plant smaller. I believe it probably would, but I would also be worried about additional damage to the plant. Now, when you repot the plant, and if you do see roots that look like they're dead or rotted, those should absolutely be removed from the plant when you're repotting.
Okay. That's it for the questions, Ben. Thank you.
All right. So we're going to talk a little bit here in this last section about common issues and frequently asked questions. There are a lot of issues that can plague cactus and succulents indoors, although outdoor succulents are also subject to a host of issues, pests, and diseases. One universal note on all of these is the first step to address most of these issues with your indoor plants is to quarantine the affected plant, just to make sure that the problem does not spread. I have not followed this advice always, and so I had a lovely mealybug outbreak along a lot of my cactus just a couple months ago, so I definitely regretted that. Rot is a very common problem, especially with cactus. When their roots are left in moist conditions, especially when it's cold, this root rot can develop very easily and honestly very quickly. It can also sort of seem quick because, this is happening under the soil level by and large. So root rot can manifest all of a sudden sometimes. But some of the visual signs that can indicate root rot may be occurring with your plant are darker or even black areas developing on the plant. If it's looking mushy, root rot is likely the cause. If the plant is emitting a foul smell, like a fetid smell, it may be due to some water that's trapped in the pot that's gone bad inside the pot, and the rot is causing that smell. It's also important to note that while root rot does usually start with the roots, it does travel up the plant. So sometimes you'll see an example of like a columnar cacti where the roots have completely rotted and the rot goes up through the center of the column cacti, the post. And when the plant finally falls over, it's sort of hollow in the middle, unfortunately. So if you see signs of rot on your plant, it's recommended to remove the plant from the pot to examine the growing media and the roots. If the soil is coming out wet, maybe your hole at the bottom of the pot has been clogged up. And if that's the case, obviously you're going to need to address that. However, if you have a plant that does exhibit the signs of root rot, the recommended course of action is to actually sector the plant or propagate it, to cut off the part of the plant that is rotted. Again, allowing that cut end of the plant to callus over for several days before you try and repot it. Sunburn, believe it or not, is an issue that happens with a lot of cactus and succulents. Even though they're from very sunny locations, they're very sensitive to light and temperature. So if you have a houseplant that you, for instance, moved from, say, a west-facing window to a south-facing window, the increase in that light and ambient temperature may stress out the plant and it may develop sunburn as a reaction. Sunburn usually looks tan, brown, or white, so the ridges on this cactus are sunburned. If you catch the sunburn early, it's not necessarily fatal. You should definitely move the plant to a shadier location for a little while to cool off and to try and recuperate a little bit before you putting it back into a sunnier location that's maybe not as sunny as the one that it was sunburned within. In extreme sunburn cases, especially where what's called the apical meristem, the center growth point of the plant has been burned, the plant may not survive, unfortunately. So in cases of really bad sunburn cases, what you may want to do is think about cutting the plant and trying to propagate a new plant to take its place. Mites will bedevil many collectors indoors. There are a couple of different types of mites that you will see. Red spider mites are really small. They're almost invisible. So using a jeweler's loupe or a magnifying glass is a helpful tool. There's also magnifying glass apps on your smartphone that you could potentially use. The false spider mites or flat mites, they don't leave the same kind of webbing that the red spider mites leave behind, and they tend to damage the tips of the leaves, whereas the red spider mites are sort of more all over the place. Mites are sucking insects, and new growth is particularly susceptible. So if you see plants that look like, some of the leaves or parts of the plants have been desiccated a little bit, that might be a signal that there's some sucking insect action happening and you may have a mite infestation. Similarly to some of these other pests, the cure for this can be mechanical. So removing these pests mechanically through a strong stream of water is something that you can do. You just want to make sure that you're not oversaturating the plant soil. You want to drain it out if you're using water to remove these mites. You can also use insecticidal soap or oils to get rid of mites. However, just know that some of your plants that have an external waxy or oily covering to protect it may really not like insecticidal soap. So what you should potentially think about doing is testing out that soap on a small area of your plant before you treat the entire specimen, just to make sure you're not going to kill the plant. Mealybugs and scale are more gross insects that will show up on both your indoor and outdoor succulents. Mealybugs are small, light-colored insects that can hide into tiniest little crevices on your plant. In the branches of your jade plant or underneath the leaves of your sedums, they can get pretty much everywhere. Scale insects are usually browner or tanner. They look like a callus or raised bump on the surface of the plant. Like mealybugs, these are both sucking insects, and they both leave a telltale stickiness on the plant. Mealybugs can also be identified by their sort of cottony appearance sometimes. That's a good way to make the distinction between them. But like the mites, you can address both of these pests mechanically through water if you'd like, or wiping them off of the plant. If that doesn't work, especially in really hard to reach places of your plant, you can consider using a diluted alcohol solution or neem oil. But again, as with the mites recommendation, you may want to test that out on a part of your plant before inoculating the whole thing. It's also recommended that when you're using neem or alcohol that you apply that treatment at night, because again, it may cause the plant to burn if it's left in the sun with that oil or that alcohol treatment on the plant. Fungus gnats or aphids are yet more bugs that can impact your plants. Fungus gnats are those gross black flies that you see on the yellow sticky trap card on the bottom right. They will come into play when your soil is consistently moist. So if you have a moisture humidity issue, you may see a lot of fungus gnats. Luckily, they're not usually a fatal challenge for the plants, but they are just kind of gross and unsanitary. So those yellow sticky traps can be really helpful to get out the actual bugs, but controlling for moisture should address most fungus gnat issues. But you can also use bacillus, which is a bacteria. It's a naturally occurring bacteria. They sell it in big box stores called mosquito bits for problematic infections. Aphids are another type of insect. They can be green, black, reddish brown. There's lots of different kinds. They're usually small and oval shaped. They also will leave a sticky residue on your plant, which is also a vector for fungal infections. So you definitely want to treat plants quickly if you have aphids, and you can use the same methods to control aphids that you would with mealybugs. For outdoor plants, primarily, slugs and snails can be an issue. Here's some telltale slug damage on, I believe, an agave plant. These animals are usually feeding at night, and their telltale sign is a slimy trail that they leave behind. They love to target new growth and emerging flower buds, and slugs and snails are also recommended to try manual extermination, which is easy. You can just pluck that thing off and throw it away. Looking at night is a good strategy since a lot of them do come out at night. Commercially available slug and snail bait is also something that you can consider. Unfortunately, this damage is usually not reversible, but as the plant grows, it will cast off these leaves and hopefully it will look better over time. Rodents and birds can be a big problem with plants outside here in our region. This poor unfortunate portulaca is from my backyard and it was completely eaten by chipmunks. The damage that comes from birds will look more like pecking, whereas rodents are probably going to try and chew and eat things. Using physical barriers is probably the only way to really prevent this from happening, like using bird netting over some of your cacti if you're having a recurring problem. It's really not recommended that you use poison to address any rodent issues due to its potential to poison further up the food chain. So for instance, if you poison that mouse, your next door neighbor's cat eats it, then your neighbor's cat dies. Or if a hawk comes and eats that mouse, it's the same thing. Mouse traps can also be effective, but just be aware that, especially on your back patio, they may catch more than just mice. So if you have an unfortunate chipmunk incident there, it's just something to keep in mind. Epithalum mosaic disease is one of a number of different viruses that can inhabit your cacti and succulents. It's usually spread by insects and is indicated by those light patches that you see on the plant. Unfortunately, this is an incurable disease. So what you're going to need to do is dispose of any infected plants. Don't put it in your compost bin. Do not take cuttings or the seeds from this plant either, because the virus may be passed along, unfortunately. So in this case, it's time to start over. The last pest or disease that I'll talk about here is this grouping of fungi. There are 4 primary fungal infections which can infect your succulent collections, including powdery mildew, the same powdery mildew that you see on a lot of outdoor plants, especially in our region, which is very humid. My peonies get powdery mildew every single fall. This looks like dust on the surface of the plant. It's supported by a lack of airflow and circulation in the plant, so keeping things dry and well circulated in terms of air is important. Copper treatments can be effective for plants that are infected with powdery mildew. Anthracnose can be seen by dark spots that cause lesions on the plant, like on this cactus pad. This spreads primarily through contaminated soils. If you have a plant with anthracnose, you're going to want to move any infected leaves. Make sure you're sterilizing your pots and tools to make sure you're not spreading it around. Copper treatment can also be effective. Sooty molds manifests as dark and unhealthy spots. This infection always happens at the same time that the plant is being attacked by other pests. So really the best way to address sooty mold is to address the pest infestation to allow the plant to recover. Finally, gray molds is particularly gross. It looks like these gross dark masses of spores that are generally found towards the stem of the plant. This is caused by a bacteria called Botrytis cinerea and likes to spread around in cool and wet weather. Copper fungicide, like with many of these other ones, can be helpful, but you're definitely going to want to remove infected portions of the plants when you do see gray mold starting. So a couple of frequently asked questions that we hear a lot from people about cacti and succulents. So why are my succulents stretching and becoming leggy like this? So there's 2 examples of a couple of plants that are exhibiting something called etiolation. And etiolation is basically your plant's response to low light situation. It's stretching the plant's structure in order to reach a lighter location. So if you have a plant that is getting leggy like this, you really want to find a better, brighter place for that plant. You should know that etiolated parts of the plant, like those little squiggly growths on that opuntia on the top, they're never going to look like an actual cactus pad. They're always going to be skinny like that. So if you want to keep the plant, it's recommended to prune off etiolated parts. You shouldn't really use those for propagation. Likely either it may not be the healthiest plant that comes out of that. The other thing that you could do with a very etiolated plant is to cut the plant and reroot it, and do some propagation for the parts that aren't etiolated. But again, you want to make sure that your plant has the light that it really needs. Why is my cactus turning brown and woody at the base, like this giant prickly pear? This is called corking. So a lot of cacti that can grow very large, or even not very large, but just larger than maybe a very small plant, may undergo this corking process in order to supplement its structural integrity to enable growth. Right? So as the plant gets taller and heavier, it needs to wooden up its stems at its base in order to support the weight on the top. So if you see that the cactus that you're looking at is turning brown from the top down, that's a sign of disease or sunburn and not corking. If they're starting at the base of the plant, working its way up, it could be corking. Although you want to keep an eye out for any mushy spots, because the plant turning up brown again can be a sign of root rot as well. So a lot of folks ask this question, what's this funky powder on my plant? Especially plants like Echeverias and some other sedums and kalanchoes have this natural coating on them called farina. Farina is a wax that the plant grows naturally to protect itself. It's a sunscreen and a moisture retention strategy to help the plant from losing too much moisture in the sun. So this is a natural thing for your plant to have, and it's not the powdery mildew, although they can look relatively similar. If your plant has a farina, this is something that's going to be around year-round, whereas if it's powdery mildew, it's only going to be happening during an active infection. Again, this is natural. It's a part of the beauty of these plants. And also know that stuff can be easily wiped off of the plant, and you can leave fingerprints behind on the leaves, which take a long time, up to many months, for that layer to regenerate. So if you have a plant with a farina layer, maybe consider not handling it too much. There are a lot of people that ask questions about why frequently you see cacti and succulents, like my lifesaver cactus here, that have a top dressing indoors. Just a note that this is both for aesthetic reasons. It looks a little bit better to the eye for some indoor plants to have some pretty horticultural grade gravel here, as well as some little garnet chips that I bought from eBay just to make it look a little pretty. But this top dressing can also keep other weed plants from growing up into your pots, and to prevent some soil-borne diseases from invading. It can also help to regulate soil temperature and moisture. what are these little hairs that are coming out of my plant? Well, these are air roots. And so this is that Echeveria that I mentioned that I propagated from an arrangement that we received. And these air roots are normal. This is something that this succulent in particular is doing because we live in an humid environment, and it was finding that it was getting more moisture from the air than it was from the soil because it is dormant at the moment. So these air roots are, again, a natural adaptation to its environment. You don't have to worry about this. In fact, if you have a stem that has some really great air roots on it, these are ideal for propagation. These particular branches that are coming off of my Echeveria are next in line to be propagated because they've already started to be rooted. Again, you do not need to remove these air roots. This is totally normal. Why is my plant changing colors? A lot of succulents, as with some other plants, do change colors in reaction to stress and changes in their environment. Succulents that are exposed to additional light, for instance, will produce chemicals including carotenoids, which produce orange, yellow, or red hues, and anthocyanin, which produces purple and blue hues. Usually the color change is due to the sunlight changes, and these are generally reversible and aren't necessarily bad for the plant. However, if you see your plant is verging on sunburn, that would be something else. In fact, many succulent collectors place their plants outdoor in the summer months in the sun specifically to get this color change before they bring it in over the winter. If you buy your succulents online, you may see that the plant pictures that they have selected on places like Etsy, they'll use pictures of the plants that are especially colorful because they are heat stressed. Sometimes you'll order a plant that looks orange or yellow online, and what you get in the mail is light green. That's because they have chosen to portray that plant in that stressed format. But again, not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a sign that your plant is reacting to some changes in this environment. For jade plants specifically, why is it forming these little white spots on the leaves? So if you can eliminate other sorts of pests and diseases from consideration, this is probably just accumulated salts that your jade plant has filtered out of the tap water that you've been using to water it. Jade plants are very efficient filtration machines. And so this is, again, just accumulated minerals that came from your tap salt that it didn't want to have inside the plant. If this is an issue for you, you can, gently rinse or wipe off your jade plant. But if you don't want this to happen in the future, you can also consider using filtered, distilled, or rainwater that doesn't have as much of these accumulated salts in them. My plant is flowering suddenly. Is this a death bloom? And the answer is maybe it is. For people who don't know what a death bloom is, plants blossom in different ways. Some succulents are a part of a grouping of plants that are called monocarpic, meaning that they only bloom once in their whole life, and then they generally fade away and die after that. Some very common cacti and succulents, including agave, sempervivum, kalanchoe, and aeonium, are plants that are monocarpic. So if you do see this plant sending off that bloom spike, like this sempervivum that we see here, it's likely going to be that death bloom for you. If you don't want the plant to die, you can try and cut off the flower stalk before it blooms to try and redirect its energy towards the main part of the plant rather than flowering. It may try to flower again, just so you know. When a death bloom occurs, many of these plants will start putting off pups or immature plants in response to that. So you may actually get a bunch of new plants with your monocarpic plants when it goes through this death bloom. And you can also consider cutting off a few leaves or cuttings at this point in time to try and propagate the plant if you want to save it. So I think that's it in terms of the presentation content. Colleen, are there any final questions that we need to work through?
No, I think we're good, Ben. Your talk was so comprehensive. I think we're all blown away. It really was wonderful, and I've had many comments already about how great it was and how people love the material. It's so unusual.
Great. This was a lot of fun to put together. I will say that it was a little bit of a struggle because I didn't really find many places where there was this broad of a look in at cacti and succulents in one spot. So I'm happy that folks enjoyed it, and I hope that they continue to find value in it moving forward.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ben.
Thank you, Colleen. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Mary.